Good morning and welcome to another episode of the Legal Zone where we tackle injustice. Good morning, Dr. Cheney.
Good morning.
Good morning, John Salati.
Morning, Mr. Phillips.
And once again, we have another amazing guest that I'm going to introduce in a minute. But first, I want to talk about something with our listening audience. Equal protection. Let me share my screen again. This is something that we hear a lot, but what does it actually mean when we say equal protection? Let's define it. Equal protection is, and you would see that I already have it typed out, so I'm not wasting time typing as we've done in the past. Equal protection, a guarantee under the 14th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States that a state, that's important, must treat an individual or a class of individuals the same as it treats others. All right, so if there's a law, the application of that law has to be evenly applied across the board. A law can be fair and just on its face, but if that law is not applied equally to everyone, then that's a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. And there's tons of other scenarios and applications of equal protection, but I just want to talk about this one. You have a law, boom, it is what it is. But if those in charge of enforcing the law choose to enforce it on some while they ignore others, that's a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. And the case that this was really displayed in is a case called Yickwo v. Hopkins. It's an old case, 1886. So what happened in Yickwo versus Hopkins? San Francisco had a law that made it illegal to operate a laundromat without the consent of the city's permission, unless that laundromat was made of stone or brick. So everyone in the city of San Francisco, if you had a laundromat and if it was stone and brick, again, this is in 1800s, you were fine. But if it was made of wood, you had to go and fill out an application and get an exemption to operate this laundromat. During those days, most of the laundromats were owned by Chinese individuals. And every time a Chinese individual went to go get the exemption, they were denied. But everyone who was non-Chinese, when they went to get an exemption, they were granted the exception and they were allowed to operate a laundromat, even though it was not made of stick, brick, or stone. So the court that went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they found that that was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. You have to treat people, the state or the government, they have to treat people fairly, just as they treat other people. So that's the backdrop of our show today. With that, I would like to introduce our guest. Our guest is none other than Mr. Chris Williams. Chris Williams is our guest today. He is a public health researcher and he's an educator at the University of Maryland, where he is pursuing his PhD in behavioral and community health. His applied equity work with an emphasis on liberation philosophy that is situated in Washington, D.C., and particularly the Southwest neighborhood. We had someone on here a few weeks ago, and they focused on the Southeast neighborhood of Washington, D.C. Chris is going to focus on the Southwest neighborhood. He spans public health research, legal writing and research, community organization, policy analysis, and news media. Mr. Williams is a dynamic community leader and policy analyst. He is a member of the DC Grassroots Coalition, which is one of the most influential voices on equity in Washington, D.C. He also serves as the editor-in-chief of Southwest Voice, the People's Paper, DC's only neighborhood-based social justice news source. Can you imagine there's just one? His most recent issue on poverty pimping, which I hope that we get to today. Poverty pimping, expose the behavior of systems that perpetuate racial inequality. You can learn more about Mr. Williams and support the Southwest Voice at southwestvoicedc.com. Again, that's southwestvoicedc.com. They are currently supporting a fundraising campaign that's going to help low-income residents in Capitol Park Plaza and Twins who are threatened by eroding affordability and displacement. Welcome, 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 Mr. Chris Williams.
Thank you so very much for having me, and I look forward to our discussion today.
Thank you. I'm glad that you decided to come on and you agreed to come on and share with us some of the injustices that are going on in Southwest DC.
Yes, happy to. It's the bread and butter of my research and my life's work to date. And so I certainly appreciate the opportunity to share many different lenses for how to combat through liberation philosophy, essentially, the forces that are catalyzing displacement and gentrification in Southwest and frankly throughout the city.
Okay, so can you give us a little history of the Southwest area and bring us up to speed? Because there's a lot of people watching who are not from DC, some that are not even in the United States. So bring us up to speed.
Oh, happy to. So the Southwest neighborhood is a historic neighborhood that dates to the founding of the nation's capital. So when Washington, D.C. was named as the permanent capital, you already had folks living here in the waterfront area. It has had a rich cultural and racial and religious history. I won't get into all the details, but what I will say is that it was a refuge for enslaved families during slavery, seeking to escape those systems of oppression and economic exploitation. It was also a place where, following the Civil War, where newly freed African Americans came and called Southwest their home. When European migration, particularly from Eastern Europe, gained steam in the second quarter of the 19th century, we saw a huge Eastern European population, along with many Irish and Italian Americans who had settled in Southwest. At one point, we had 3 synagogues. It was a very diverse, one of the most diverse neighborhoods in Washington, D.C., and protected in a way because it was surrounded by water on all sides at one point. It was called the Island. But as changes occurred in Washington, D.C., this neighborhood was threatened. And what we had was the most pernicious form of neighborhood change ever in American community planning, which was urban renewal.
When did this start?
Urban renewal, actually Southwest was the second site in the United States for wholesale neighborhood demolition. It's hard to grasp that the government, and mind you, we are not a state here, so this is essentially the federal government acting, going into a neighborhood and demolishing every single building and displacing every single person. So urban renewal happened again early on in Southwest, and we were actually a test case that ultimately ended up in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court essentially said that eminent domain allowed the government to do exactly what it was planning to do, which was community erasure. And in fact, the government could justify community erasure for something as simple as beautification. If it wanted to get rid of all the buildings and put up trees, if it wanted to get rid of all the buildings and put in a parking lot.
So when you say, so just so we get things in context, you're saying that these buildings, homes, homes and buildings are one and the same?
Yes, it's every single structure for
So there's-
business and for homes.
So they're going in and they're tearing down people's homes.
Yes, this was in the 1950s and 60s. It happened all throughout American cities. You essentially saw 2 million Americans over approximately 2 decades completely displaced. It predominantly affected African American communities, but also many white ethnic communities, particularly in Boston, were also affected. So generally what they did was they went in, demolished every single structure, and they probably put in a highway through that community. Or if they didn't demolish the community, they put in a highway anyway. And so we had both of those instances happen in Southwest. So I-395, for those who are familiar with the Washington metropolitan area, was that highway that cut through what was a historic, predominantly African-American community. We don't often teach this injustice, but it's important that we know our history. To give you another example, it also happened in Charlottesville, Virginia. Folks in Charlottesville, I am a graduate of the University of Virginia, we were taught about Vinegar Hill. So they essentially put in the early 1950s, they put on a ballot. Of course, mind you, in the early 1950s, there were many barriers, legal and otherwise, to prevent African Americans from voting. And so they put an initiative on the ballot in the early 1950s saying, should we demolish Vinegar Hill? And of course, the voters, who were predominantly white, said yes. And they let that land fallow for nearly 15 years before they did anything. It was just a piece of vacant land. So this happened again. Southwest was the Supreme Court case that catalyzed this redevelopment. I mentioned the synagogues earlier. So it was the Jewish business owners here in Southwest took it all the way to the Supreme Court, because what they argued was that you are essentially taking away my right to have a business. And oh, by the way, you're saying that my building is not up to code, but it is in fact up to code. So what you're essentially doing is you're giving my right to have a business over to someone else, some capitalist who's going to come in and build luxury developments, which is what happened in the initial phase of urban renewal in Southwest.
Okay. So, and this started in the 1950s in Southwest DC.
The plans for Southwest urban renewal go back as early as the 1940s, but it had languished. And it wasn't until the Eisenhower administration that redevelopment was accelerated. And the Eisenhower administration actually had a special liaison to what was then the Redevelopment Land Agency, which was the federal entity overseeing redevelopment in Southwest, to ensure that redevelopment and wholesale injustice would happen, and would happen quickly. And it did. And we need to really appreciate this, not just as a social justice, racial justice issue, but we lost a significant history of our nation's capital. The historic buildings that were demolished. We know that the first mayor, not mayor under our current notion of mayor, but mayor back to the early 19th century in Washington, D.C. had a home. That home likely nowadays would be deemed historic. We had many other historic buildings. I mean, mind you, much of the pictures that we have of the old Southwest very much resembled Capitol Hill, very much resembled Georgetown. It was a beautiful community. We had garden homes, and again, we had industrialists, capitalists come into the neighborhood saying, oh, we're here now, and we're going to characterize your neighborhood as a slum.
Now,
And so,
you said something very important. You said the Southwest neighborhood resembled Georgetown and Capitol Hill.
Mhm.
We're talking about equality. Did this same sort of demolition that's going on in Southwest happen in Georgetown? And if not, why not?
Yeah, good question. You're really testing my knowledge here, but luckily I can answer your questions. So there was an attempt in Georgetown to do something similar. So I believe it's M Street is the main street that goes through Georgetown. So south of M Street actually was slated for wholesale demolition. Much of it, as we know today, was preserved, and there is a specific Historic Preservation Act for Georgetown. So what they did was they leveraged their political and social capital to ensure that they would have that preservation that Southwest did not see. If we think about Capitol Hill and other neighborhoods, despite Southwest's long history here in the nation's capital, we do not have, we are not a historic district. So many of these communities, particularly white communities, if I'm to be frank, realize that they needed another mechanism to prevent their neighborhood from happening what happened to Southwest. And so what we have are two things. We have not only historic districting throughout neighborhood historic districting throughout Washington, D.C., but we have a lot more individual buildings that are deemed historic than many older cities in the United States. Philadelphia is much older than Washington, D.C., of course, but we have a much higher percentage of our buildings that are historic. And so we see the racism there. Many white communities continue to enjoy their homes. They were not threatened by eminent domain, but Southwest was. And actually, frankly, Southwest continues to undergo a new form of urban renewal, which I'll get to.
So what I'm hearing you say is that these historic Black neighborhoods, they're being treated differently than the historic white neighborhoods. Is that it?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, we know that to be true from the history books. But the issue is that if we don't know our history, we don't see that it's repeating. If we don't know our history, then we don't know to galvanize our community in order to address these threats early on. Luckily, I happen to be very interested in history. Luckily, I happen to like to do tours of the neighborhood, historic tours. And so I'm able to really speak to these issues. But no doubt, the racism that existed then that we feel is so in a different era is actually just in another form these days. And again, I'll get to how that took shape over time.
Yeah.
What I will say about urban renewal is that initially, when the buildings were demolished, and mind you, we had dozens of churches in Southwest, we had hundreds of businesses in Southwest. Southwest extended all the way to Independence Avenue. And for folks who are familiar with Washington, D.C., Independence Avenue goes right along our Hirshhorn Museum and right along the Botanic Gardens. So that's Independence Avenue. So it was a vibrant neighborhood, okay? And we only recently, probably within the last 10 to 15 years, actually recovered our population that was lost. So initially, luxury developments came in, okay? And technically, this is public land, right? So the government comes in, says eminent domain, it becomes public land, and we put luxury buildings. And for the most part, you had a lot of people in support, including former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a very large proponent of what they call clearing of slum dwellings, okay? So one part of the narrative that was sold to the public and to politicians was that there was just too much slum housing in Southwest, meaning folks have outdoor toilets, things like this. And it was true. There was a lot of that in Southwest, no doubt, particularly in alley housing. But most of Southwest actually wasn't slum dwellings. But if you go back and read, say, the Washington Post articles from the 50s and the run up to urban renewal, you would think that all of Southwest are these slum dwellings. They're not actually. And so, but that helped to catalyze the change. When Eleanor Roosevelt came back to Washington, D.C., following the demolition and following the construction of several buildings, the Washington Post interviews her and says that as she's taking a tour, her first question was, where did all the people go? right? Of course, that was an obvious answer to her question, but it really goes to show you how if we do not think through many of these issues, we will be left asking those kinds of questions. Where did the people go? Okay. But once the public really realized what was going on, when the first buildings go up in Southwest, again, luxury developments, there was a call for addressing the housing needs of people who were displaced. And Southwest, this is sort of the sunshine. I've given you the rain. Here's the sunshine, is that there was an effort on the part of the governing body for Washington, D.C. to restore low-income housing. So Southwest actually has 3 very large public housing communities. The Washington, D.C. had received a grant from what is now HUD for public housing construction, and they can concentrate at 3 of those properties here in Southwest. And so actually, not only—
What 3 properties are those?
So it's Greenleaf, James Creek, and Syfax.
Okay.
So we have actually, it's one of the, on paper, it's one of the greatest concentrations of Black poverty in the United States. We have over 70,000 census tracts in the United States. And my research showed that our census tract containing those 3 public housing properties today ranks as 199 for the greatest concentration of Black poverty. But I don't want to say that to say that that's necessarily bad, because actually we're quite a resilient community. We have critical mass, and we are surrounded by a lot of health resources, a lot of health promoting resources, and our community is very tight. People stay here for a very long time because they have housing security, okay? And our reputation throughout the city is that Southwest is a very close-knit community, and we are fighters. Much like the business owners during the 1950s took their case all the way to the Supreme Court, you are seeing in Southwest the kind of community organizing to fight against systems of oppression, particularly systems of gentrification and displacement and inequity. And so we're very proud of that fact. Despite the fact that, at least on paper, there is an immense amount of poverty concentration. So we ended up recovering a lot of the low-income housing, and my building, which is not public housing, but within the last 20 years, it shifted to what they call low-income housing tax credit. So we are 65% of people who are what I would say housing insecure, meaning that they need to rely on some form of government subsidy. And so that LIHTC designation has also helped to increase and maintain our social diversity here in Southwest. So Southwest, following urban renewal, which was a form of trauma, okay? And that's how we need to really view it. Ultimately, the community did recover, but now we're back in a cycle of trauma, and I'll talk about that in just a moment.
Before I turn it over to Dr. Cheney, talk to us about what's going on now.
Right.
So we have a number of challenges broadly. We have essentially racist planning on the part of the district, the DC Council, the mayor, not just the current mayor, former mayors, the executive branch, are complicit in an effort that has directly displaced residents and threatened the affordability and social diversity of Southwest. And so there are really, there's really, right at this point, one main channel, and that is through public projects. So there are these public-private partnerships that has largely resulted in luxury housing, that has largely welcomed non-minority populations.
Now, when you say luxury housing, can you define that so we get a clear picture?
So luxury housing is based on what we call area median income. And so once you are about certainly at 80% area median income. Mind you, area median income in Washington, D.C. is over $100,000. So once you're about $80,000, it's essentially market housing. It's luxury housing. It's not targeted to where the average African-American in Washington, D.C. is.
So if I wanted to go to one of these areas and rent out an apartment, what would I be paying?
Now you're going to be paying $2,200, $2,500 for a studio 1-bedroom.
Say that again, because we have some people, like I said, all across the country and in other countries where rent for a 2-bedroom is $500. So what is it for a studio?
Oh, a studio is at least $2,000 if you want to get into these new buildings. $2,000, $2,500. I mean, the typical amount is $2,200 to $2,500 for a studio 1-bedroom.
And so obviously certain minorities can't afford that.
Of course not. And the city council is ignorant of this fact. I recently had a community call with a DC council member, and I told her, mind you, I'm very knowledgeable about these things. I said, well, how are African Americans to get into these buildings when the average Black household income in Washington, D.C. is around $45,000? And she says, well, no, it's not $45,000. Of course it's $45,000. You don't. And she's on the housing committee. She doesn't know, they're ignorant of these facts. Of course, Black people can't get in. And while there are programs to help support, so for example, if you have a voucher, but the voucher system is increasingly, vouchers are certainly difficult to get a hold of because they rely on some form of government funding. But the vouchers are capped. And so as the area median income is increasing, and so say, today you're going to, a 1-bedroom is $2,200, $2,500. But we're steadily increasing the luxury developments in Washington, D.C. and Southwest, then that apartment now is $2,700. But your voucher only covers, $1,500. So now you're left to pay the difference.
And that difference is even too much for the average African American.
Correct. What we saw, so the DC Council on Racial Equity, which is an entity within DC Council that evaluates policy proposals, regularly evaluates proposed legislation through a racial equity lens. Okay, and what they said was that and here I'm quoting, since 2006, the poverty rate increased for Black residents. So not only is the average median income so substantially lower, it's actually 1/3 lower than the average white income, but it is declining. In my neighborhood, or in the Southwest, my zip code, I should say, I ran data, and since 2010, Black median household income in Southwest has decreased. How is it that in 2010 we could be in a recession, and 10 years later, when we're not in a recession, the period ended in the analysis that I did was from 2010 to 2019. How is it that for nearly a decade, Black household median income didn't increase? There's a racist system. It's a racist system that has many different roots. And one of the roots is around housing inequity. And we know this to be true. Washington, D.C. is the #1 city for intense gentrification and Black displacement in the entire nation in the 21st century. So the agency that put this particular report out, NCRC, National Community, I forget exactly the acronym, but NCRC, they did 2 studies. And the second study showed that Washington, D.C. Dropped in the ranking, right? So the first study looked at, I believe, a 12-year period. The second study looked at a 4-year period. So first of all, I'm a researcher, you're comparing apples and oranges. But what I realize is that if you combine the 2 data sets, then what you get is the #1 epicenter of Black gentrification and displacement in the United States for the last 20 years.
Wow. Wow. All right, Dr. Cheney, I'm about to turn it over to you to ask Chris some questions now. Floor is yours.
Okay. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you.
I want to share this little story with you, or anecdote. Years ago, after I moved to Southwest Washington, D.C., my name surfaced as the editor of the other Southwest local paper. The then editor was moving from the area. She called and came to my home and dropped off a mock-up of the paper. Lots of documents. I got too busy, probably in grad school or whatever, maybe before grad school, and never followed through on the agreement. Your Southwest News Oregon is really revealing some earth-shaking matters. I am so glad it's available. I just want to say that to you.
Thank you.
I was hoping and praying that you would get into the article, Poverty Pimping. I was
Yes.
mesmerized by that article. I've told everybody I know about that article. It's so philosophical, it's so on point. It put me back into the graduate mode. Anyway, let's dive further into your piece on poverty pimping.
Poverty pimping. I like that name.
Pimping. And we all have heard the street term pimp. And I thought it was really interesting how you did what you did with that article. So who are the pimps in the procurement process in your twist on this social ill? And do they follow any rules? Because we've heard this person historically say, by any means necessary. So do these pimps follow any rules?
Mm-hmm. So I'll preface my remarks by saying that I believe in Black liberation philosophy. I don't need to be told what to do, right?
Mhm.
It's a novel concept. I can emancipate myself and my mind, and I can use my resources, my assets, and my community's resources and assets to get what we want. We don't need permission. And so the Southwest Voice comes out of a need to speak to race and racism in a way that the other paper in Southwest, it's been around for decades, but they lost their way. And I realized that in terms of neighborhood change, they refused to cover it. And everything about development in that paper's view was positive. But of course, we knew it wasn't positive because there was a silent majority, multiracial silent majority in Southwest that increasingly became concerned about eroding affordability and threats to our social diversity and neighborhood character. And so I set about, I was a student, I still am a student. I didn't have a lot of funds to publish a paper copy, which the other paper is, but I knew I had one thing. I knew I could write. And I knew I could put together an electronic newspaper, and I knew I had a certain perspective that needed to be heard. And the latest piece that you're speaking of, which is poverty pimping, the background on that is that I had helped an organization here in Southwest get off the ground. And I noticed that there were very few African Americans in our group. And so I really, I helped to found the organization, but we had essentially several sort of co-leaders. And when I asked, I said, well, what are you doing about engaging with low income and Black residents in Southwest? It's a substantial population here. Oh, they said, well, we'll go to them when we need them. Oh. And they said, moreover, we think they'll slow us down. Oh. So I immediately got out of that conversation, and I then sent a letter warning African Americans in the community. So fast forward, that group then asked for support for a public housing, asked public housing to support their efforts to have a development in Southwest. So the Southwest leader, and I'll name her, A. Dina Walker. She's the president of Greenleaf Gardens, a dear friend of mine. She replied back, and there were lots of community leaders on this email. She says, "You are a poverty pimp." And I never thought about that before. I never thought about what poverty pimp. I had to Google it. I had no idea what she was talking. And she elaborated. And so I said to her, and I've always said this to my friends and neighbors in public housing, is that there is so much wisdom, so much knowledge, so much skill that society takes for granted, or actually doesn't bestow any sort of these notions onto them at all. They think that they're sort of full of deficits. But I always go to them when I need a spiritual word. And I thought about that article. I thought about what she said. And I said, oh my goodness, it's all around us. Poverty, pimping is all around us. So we have not just politicians who promise one thing during re-election and deliver something else, but we have people like this other group that I was talking about saying that they sort of went out into the community saying we're anti-racist, but when it comes to really involving African Americans in their work, it's like we don't really need them. So the poverty pimping occurs throughout society, and we wonder why racial, health, and economic disparities persist. Now, this is a big topic because I talked about politicians in the article. I talked about this particular community organization, but I also talked about the DC Housing Authority. So the DC Housing Authority, they're trying to redevelop Greenleaf. Now, mind you, they have allowed residents to be exposed to all sorts of threats to their lives. In fact, the Attorney General last year had to settle a lawsuit with the Housing Authority to get the Housing Authority to do basic things to look out for residents' welfare. So they had to install cameras, they had to get more security guards, they had to take basic precautions. Okay. But then what they did was during the meetings with residents about redevelopment, they said they put out these sort of glamorous pictures that you could pull from a home and garden magazine or Martha Stewart blog or website, and they were full of these ultra luxury club. I mean, these pictures had club rooms, it had community hall, it had a computer lab, it had this sort of glistening pool with balconies, ultra luxury. And they said, oh, don't you want us to proceed with redevelopment? That's exploitative because they know that they have allowed these residents to be in such horrible, inhumane housing conditions, from mold, from poor air quality, from deteriorating walls, and these issues persist. And mind you, these housing conditions were so acute, so deteriorated, that DC Council said, we're going to give the Housing Authority $50 million to accelerate public housing repairs because the conditions are just so awful. Do you know for most of this fiscal year, they did not spend more than 80, they didn't spend, they spent under 20% of that $50 million. They didn't want to spend it. They didn't want to spend it because they wanted to accelerate redevelopment. And so when DC Council asked them after there was a change in leadership with the executive director, why aren't you spending this money? We are well into the third quarter of the fiscal year, yet you have spent less than 20% of the $50 million that we gave you. Why? And they said, the new executive director said, oh, we're trying, we're working, we're trying to spend the money. So this goes to show you how the Housing Authority pimps residents. So they want residents to support this project that we're already beginning to see as displacing residents. So they sent letters to residents saying, oh, don't you want to move to Southeast? You don't want to stay in Southwest anymore. I'm sort of dramatizing it, but it was essentially an enticement to move out of their community. And of course they did, because they were living in horrid conditions. But then that would allow them to essentially empty the building. So we have a senior building in Southwest that's half empty. So they're trying to renovate this entire building, a whole new building, as they're saying, while the remaining residents are still in it. And the residents are complaining about air pollution. They're complaining about smells, all kinds of fumes that are getting into their apartment.
Dr. Cheney, anything else?
Yeah, I have two quick ones.
Okay.
Chris, you just talked about an area that I wanted you to say a little bit more about, the DC Director of Housing Authority and the Greenleaf residents. The idea that in your article it stated that the Housing Authority sort of encouraged the people to move and then is given mixed messages that they really didn't do that. They moved on their own. And that the thing that I was interested in this is that HUD, based on what I get, was really not notified, and they should have been, of this interaction. And I want to ask you, do you think that this insufficient oversight, which has resulted in the DC government bypassing HUD in these and other similar incidents of urban renewal, so to speak, or gentrification?
Oh, absolutely. You have such, I don't like to throw out the word corruption, so I won't apply it to a specific entity because, of course, I would be legally liable. But there's corruption going in Washington, D.C., without a doubt. And so the example that you from the article, which was that what they essentially did at Greenleaf Senior was a relocation plan for the Greenleaf redevelopment.
Mm-hmm.
And that redevelopment plan has to go to HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It did not. And so when the executive director gets on calls with residents, she tries to spin it as, oh, this was resident choice. She doesn't mention the letters that went out. She doesn't mention the conditions, resident choice. And what we also know, so Southwest Voice also had a major story several months ago where a whistleblower from the DC Housing Authority came to us and said, oh, by the way, the Greenleaf redevelopment, yeah, the whistleblower alleged that the Greenleaf redevelopment actually violated federal procurement laws. Who's looking at that? That individual, that whistleblower, has actually provided substantial evidence to DC council members and to HUD, and says that during the Trump administration, HUD was aware of these allegations, but decided to not pursue them on account of political reasons. I don't know where
who
that
was the
case is
director
in
of
terms of
HUD during that time?
I forget the, oh, it was Ben Carson.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ben
And
Carson.
he's African American.
But that doesn't mean.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll just-
And so yes, we have widespread issues with the housing authority. There was a recent story with so they have a board of commissioners at the housing authority. There was a recent story that the head of the board of commissioners at the DC Housing Authority funneled, again, these are allegations that he funneled money to his girlfriend, contracts that she was not really eligible to receive, as the story states. But these are, multi-million-dollar contracts that she allegedly received over a period of time. So in my opinion, the violations of the law, the racial disparate impact of neighborhood change on minority communities, to me, there's only one solution. And that solution is that DC needs to be back under a 90s style control board. The issue with we had, of course, a control board during the 90s. That control board was led by what would be future Mayor Anthony Williams. And the reason for the control board was that we didn't have enough money. Right? We just were in a fiscal deficit. But we have the opposite problem now, which is what we have too much money. The land in Washington, D.C. is too valuable. And these conditions are really leading to vast inequality and what I believe is complete and systematic corruption.
Chris, I have just one more. Tell us about your views about lack of Southwest leadership and fairness in connecting the two wards, Southwest and Southeast.
Mm-hmm. So this is a really interesting turn of events. So with redistricting now, what we see is that Ward 6 So for folks listening, a ward is just a district. It's just a political district that we use to elect representatives to DC Council. And so Ward 6 is the epicenter really of all of the major developments in the city: NOMA, Navy Yard, Buzzard Point, the Wharf. And that particular position has become too powerful. And because of gentrification, it also has too many people. It needs to lose at least 17,000 people with the new redistricting that we have to do due to the 2020 census. So you have a lot of what I like to call old heads. I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but just the old guard in Southwest, who's very wedded to see our community go the way of Navy Yard, which is that we have these luxury buildings, their property values going to double and triple. And maybe the social costs are that Black people no longer live in the neighborhood, but at least now my house is worth $2 million. So you have that group in Southwest. And so they want to stay in Ward 6. But you have other voices like Southwest Voice and others in the community is like, timeout. Nope. It's time to break up the developer power base that exists in Ward 6, because it's frankly, Ward 6 council member has become far too powerful. And so minorities in Southwest who have been ignored for a considerable amount of time, decades, and I've pointed out many of the injustices. I'll just highlight another one: environmental racism. So the DC council chairman, Phil Mendelson, has publicly stated in the Washington Post that there is environmental racism that exists in Southwest due to building essentially industrial activity next to public housing down in Buzzard Point. Now, in a separate news story, I believe it was a few months later, he was pointedly asked in an editorial whether or not the city's new interest in cleaning up Buzzard Point was related to the incoming white population. That was the question: incoming white population. The DC chairman, mind you, Phil Mendelson, has been on DC Council since 1999. He replied, not in a particularly astute way, but in his account, an honest way. So to the question of whether or not the city is interested in now cleaning up the environmental racism and the air pollution in Buzzard Point, his answer was probably due to the incoming white population. So where we are in Southwest is that we are not having the kind of equal representation as other constituents in Southwest, particularly those who are propertied. And we would be better off in a majority minority district. So Ward 8, as you know, is overwhelmingly African American. It also has many very acute racial and economic disparities. It is time for Ward 8 to cross Anacostia River and for Southwest to be in a better position of maintaining our social diversity and addressing, frankly, racial inequity and really course correcting. Much of this development in Southwest, again, are public projects. So the Wharf, for example, the Wharf, which looks very nice. A lot of people come to Washington, they have millions of visitors per year. They built on public land. It still is public land. And they have a 99-year lease, similar to the Trump Hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue. 99-year lease. You want to know how much they're paying for that 99-year lease? $1. They're paying $1. Initially, once they got the contract, they were committed to deeply affordable housing. So this is housing that was really at where African Americans were in terms of income, 30 to 50% AMI. But then once they got the contract, they went to DC Council in 2010 and they said, oh, we can't build that low income and moderate income housing. We would like to peg those, quote, affordable housing at 80% AMI up to 120% AMI, because we believe that that's what we can build. Of course, Southwest Voice had done a report on the developer for the Wharf, which was P. and Hoffman. And what we showed was that over a 20-year period, they had a consistent pattern of what I call social whitening, Once they had gone into a community, we largely saw the Black population go down and the white population go up. But yet they were given the contract and allowed to essentially be exempt from what were their initial deep affordable housing commitments. And so in the census tract containing the wharf, we saw, following phase one, doubling of the white population from around 300 to over 600. Black population went up 56 people. 50, that's what the data show, the federal data show, 56 people. Now, the census tracts didn't only contain the wharf, it contained other developments as well. So many of those 56 households actually were not at the wharf. And so again, given the acuity of racial disparities and violations of the law, equal protection was mentioned at the top of the call. Now, equal protection, you made a point about equal protection applying to states, but what I want to say is that equal protection also applies to the District of Columbia.
And this is a
Even though
snapshot
it's not a state.
This is a snapshot of the wharf, correct?
Yes, that's a snapshot of the wharf. And I'm glad you brought up this picture also because it shows I-395, that highway that went through the Black community during urban renewal. So that's I-395 there.
So all this stuff here is new, this new development, and to live here, it's ridiculously high.
Oh yes, of course. It's the wharf. It's the luxury. You know, back as far back as the 2000s, P. and Hoffman, the developer, had on its website, because of course the internet is archived, so you can go back and look at their websites from the Wayback Machine. They described what they do as ultra luxury. So it's no wonder, fast forward, 15 years, that's what they want to do. Ultra luxury housing. But again, there are social costs to the government capitulating to these developers who just go, from neighborhood to neighborhood, and the effect being Black displacement. So that's a way to answer your question, Dr. Cheney, which is that we need another way of political representation that really involves being absorbed into a majority minority district.
Thank you.
John, before we let Mr. Williams go, do you have anything?
Not a specific question. I just want to say, wow, he's laid it out so well. Like, what's there to say? There's certainly no questions about it. I would, I guess, a small question, redistricting is happening probably slowly at this point, but are you seeing any moves in this direction of shifting the Southwest into the kind of ward setup that you think would be more favorable?
Ward 6, Southwest will be moved into Ward 8. I gave a testimony on behalf of Southwest Voice, but I also was, well, not joined, but we were sort of in the same session with a former, what we call ANC here, but they are just sort of a neighbor. Anyway, I don't want to sort of, for your international listeners, but ANC in a former ANC member who sort of has her own constituency, even though she's no longer a political official, did not come in support of Southwest staying in Ward 6. She says, well, whatever happens, happens. Just keep us as one community. So the council, the Committee on Redistricting has heard that loud and clear, and they realize that something's got to give. And so I would probably say have a 95% chance of being moved into Ward 8. What I will also say is that I didn't talk about all the issues happening here in Southwest. There's a vast amount of sources of inequity. So for example, along Capitol Street, so for those who have ever gone to a game at Nats Stadium, or maybe even the Audi Field, you likely would have taken South Capitol. And what the district did on the southwest side of South Capitol has said that we're going to zone this area, or we're going to change the land use so that these developments don't have to have affordable housing. What? They don't have to have affordable housing. And so when the developers proposed projects and they said, well, we're not going to put in affordable housing because we don't have to. Of course, the community was very upset by this. And their first offer came back and said, we'll put in 1 unit out of over 400 units, 1 unit. And then they came back with another counter offer. I think it was then to 12. So what we have to realize is that the sources of gentrification, inequity, frankly, if we want to also look at income inequality, how the rich get richer at our expense. And I'm not just talking about our expense as low and moderate income, but those who are making up to $200,000, your income's not increasing that much either. These are the channels that the rich get richer. And there's another development in Southwest, Randall School. So Randall School was a historic Black junior high school. Marvin Gaye, the famous singer, went there. And the city pegged the affordable housing, much of the affordable housing, at 80% AMI. That was also the way what it pegged for the wharf. Now, 80% AMI is significant. Again, that's not where the median household Black income is in Washington, D.C. And then they said, oh, we're going to give the developers a 20-year tax abatement. And so that particular proposed agreement went to the then chief financial officer. He has since moved on. And his office did an evaluation of this proposal. He says, this is ridiculous. There's no reason why you need to give them a 20-year tax abatement.
20 years.
20-year tax abatement for what was a former public land and for what is a former school. And so the first part of the school, the historic part, will be an art gallery. An art gallery. Oh, interesting. For some, private collector. Oh, okay.
Wow.
And the second part will, again, most overwhelmingly market rate. And so it is extensive what is happening in Southwest. There are, of course, many other cases. What I will say about Greenleaf redevelopment is that what the Housing Authority is proposing for the redevelopment plan for public housing is only to restore the number of existing units. Mind you, the housing crisis in Washington, D.C. is largely, overwhelmingly affecting African Americans. And for the Housing Authority to not pursue its mission of affordable housing production and only to maintain the current number of affordable units is a social injustice. And so what they want to do is that they want to build over 100 townhomes, sell public land, and sell those townhomes. Of course, the townhomes are going to be worth upwards of $2 million.
Wow.
And then they want all the remaining 600 so units that they're planning, they want those to be market. And then the executive director said in a recent call with residents, oh, we need to deconcentrate poverty. And I corrected her. I corrected her by email, and I also corrected her during the meeting, which is that as a matter of general principle, it is good to deconcentrate poverty. But in Southwest, we have easy access to transportation. We have a clinic across the street from Greenleaf Public Housing. We have access to all of these neighborhood amenities. Actually, this is a fantastic neighborhood if you and your family happen to be low income. This is because of the resilience and because of the built environment. But yet they want to, again, use this notion of deconcentrating poverty to sell the poverty pimping, okay, without telling the full story. And the full story, of course, is that they are working for developers. And they're working to line the pockets of those developers who want to come in, exploit our land, exploit our people, and make lots of money for the 1%. I'll just say this, my last comment, is that the wharf, again, was public land. And the developer was allowed to raise the necessary funds to build phase 1 and phase 2. In the run up to phase 2, they announced that they had refinanced their loan, and they announced some new investor entities. And I did not recognize one particular invested entity, but I saw that it had Canadian in the name. And I looked it up. It turns out that one of the investors for the wharf, again, public land, is the entity that invests the retirement funds for Canadian public employees. So you mean to tell me that we are going to deeply subsidize public land at the wharf for $1 for a 99-year lease, and Canadian public employees benefit from that investment? Something very un-American about that. When I asked Robert White, who's on DC Council, about that, and I told him essentially what was happening, and I was very concerned, and I emailed the entire council on that email. He replied, he says, well, this happens all the time. This is the kind of system that we are in, and this is exactly why we need a control board in Washington, D.C., because there's no regard for the law, no regard for really, I think, what it means to be an American. So you sell an entity to, allow another entity to benefit from public land. It's just, I mean, not to mention $300 million that also went into the wharf, aside from the heavily subsidized price of the land. And mind you, the property values, you could argue, oh, the property values at the wharf because of all the tourists and restaurants, that's going to go into education. Well, no, because they did something else. They created a separate fund so that the money that would usually go into the general budget for education, they've carved out another fund that now goes into, and that fund does not fund our schools. It does not fund our roads. It does not do any of those things that we would want it to do to improve the social conditions for DC residents. Instead, it goes into a pot of money that essentially helps to build up the value of properties that are being built all along the Anacostia watershed. So these are the properties along Navy Yard, properties along Southwest, and both sides of the Anacostia River. This is what I'm saying is very deep and very troubling, but frankly, it emboldens me as a researcher and activist, because I can get on calls like this and essentially
How can people support you again? What's the website?
So we would love support for the Capitol Park Plaza and Twins efforts to essentially build a legal defense fund against efforts to erode affordability and displace residents. And so on our website, southwestvoicedc.com, you can see the link there. I should say that I'm the co-president of that tenant association. I fight hard. But that money is to be used. We have a board. That money is being used for our legal defense fund. We're currently trying to fight against an effort on the part of the owners to say that we do not have TOPA rights, tenant to purchase, tenant opportunity to purchase for our building, because there's a sale transfer. And so in our mind, there are efforts to abridge our legal rights and what the law really says. And so we're hoping to fight that. We're also seeing efforts around not renewing residents' leases and putting them month to month, which could really make them susceptible to displacement. And so again, all of those funds go to the legal defense fund, because we just need to be able to fight this in court. And because of our large low-income population here, we really have our hands tied in so many ways. We don't have membership dues because we want people to really be active in the tenant association, which they are. If you would like to support Southwest Voice, we've not yet started our campaign, but we are gearing up for a campaign in the next few months to not only have a paper copy of our newspaper, but also to help other community organizations in Southwest, such as our public housing residents who are having their own fights with redevelopment and helping to build our community resilience. So I'd really love an opportunity to talk with sort of angel, I can't say angel investors, it's investing in human capital, but it's really folks who are willing to back the mission and goals of Southwest Voice. We've done remarkable things. We put out the first ever rubric for how to score development based on equity measures. Other groups have adopted that.
If someone wanted to contact you directly, would they be able to on their website? What's the best way to contact you directly?
Yeah, so you can contact me in a number of ways. So the Southwest Voice can be contacted at info@southwestvoicedc.com. And so for Southwest, you have to spell it out. So info@southwestvoicedc.com. My personal email address, which I'm happy to give out as well, is Chris Williams, ChrisWilliams 06@gmail.com. You can also reach me there. We not only do really hard charging news, but we also do community awards. We also have had interns. We've also put out policy analyses, and we're really hoping to build our capacity as a board. Our board is mainly made up of public housing residents and mostly minority. Again, we're trying to fight through the forces of gentrification, displacement, exploitation through a liberation framework, drawing on our own expertise, wisdom, knowledge, and sense of community to ultimately have a better future.
Thank you so much, Mr. Williams, for being on our show and educating us. I mean, my mind is still blank. I have to take a few days to absorb all of what you said, because this is something that's going on that the majority of people have no idea what's going on. And so thank you for educating us and letting us know about this huge injustice. And we'll keep in touch. I'll definitely contact you.
Okay, appreciate the opportunity. I'm an educator, sorry, so I can talk a lot. So thank you for cutting me off.
Take care, Chris.
Okay, thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Wow. So I'm gonna start with you, Dr. Cheney, before I let John have the last word. I know housing is a big thing that you're in. So what were some of your takeaways with this?
I just think it's great that he's doing what he's doing, and I'm going to volunteer
Oh,
to see if I can help.
awesome. John, the injustices this here.
Well, I mean, the whole thing was rife with injustices, but I think what I'll focus on is the role of the government, I mean, the city government, the elected officials, who, as he said, this is standard operating procedure, taking public resources and then handing them over to private elements. I have no problem, like you talked about that company, TN Hoffman or something. Their thing is we build ultra luxury. Fine, they're a private entity. They can do that. That's their right to build as a company what they want to build. The injustice here is a public entity, the District of Columbia government, is handing this private entity that has a goal of developing this kind of housing and say, yeah, here you go. We're going to give it to you essentially for nothing.
He said $1 for 99 years.
Well, when he talked about ANCs, when I was an ANC, an advisory neighborhood commissioner, that was an issue at the development of the McMillan sand filtration site, which still goes on in the city, where, yeah, you have this historic resource there in the neighborhood. They're just on North Capitol side, where the city is essentially giving most of it away to private developers who are bent on then building, 80% AMI is what they want to try to put forth is that's affordable housing. $80,000 is somebody making that kind of income is considered affordable housing. Now, I grant you, DC is a high expense place. But when you're saying we are trying to make available low-income housing, that is poverty for people, housing that is available for people who are not making a lot of money, somewhere in the neighborhood of, let's say they're making $35,000, $45,000, $50,000, and you have the city saying, well, 80% AMI is perfectly okay. You're not getting housing that's meeting the needs of the people that are there. So then you have the DC Housing Authority patting themselves on the back because, look, we're going to maintain the number of units that we had before, which, again, knowing the history of the DCHA, that actually is an improvement over what's often happened at DC public housing, where they end up losing units. So in some respects, they are doing better. At that point, you put the bar so low that, the fact that we're just keeping with what we've had, and we're not addressing the fact that the city, even though DC has now, since the 2000 census, has been steadily growing, which it has, no doubt about it, yet the proportion of people who are in the lower income bracket and therefore predominantly African American residents is continuing to decline. So the injustice here is the DC government that should be working to maintain, at least maintain the people that are here, that have lived here, are taking all kinds of steps that, even if it is not the intent as you had in the original slide, the disproportional impact is on lower income African American residents. So the government's thing is we want to increase the tax revenue because that allows us to do other good things. I get that. But you're looking at policies that are having such damaging effects that the Washington D.C. of 2030 will have almost no clear reflection of the Washington D.C. of 1990. They will be totally different cities because Washington, most people may not understand this, Washington is a very small, very compact city. And so the changes that are going on there, by the time we get to 2030, the DC of 1990 will essentially not exist. There's the injustice.
It's good to see that it's not only attorneys that's fighting injustice. It's good to see that there's other people who are recognizing these injustices and they're taking up arms and they're fighting. And we'll support Mr. Williams anyway. Thank you, Dr. Cheney, for letting it be known that you are going to support him, and we'll do all that we can as well. Thank you, Dr. Cheney. Thank you, Mr. Salati. And we will see you all. Don't forget to subscribe, the bottom below in the red button, and we will see you all next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching our video. For experienced legal services in Washington, D.C., Alabama, and Washington State, visit our website at remuslaw.com or call us at 1-833-329-1799.
When someone goes through a divorce, they lose their best friend. They lose their house. They lose their children. Any time away from your child is a loss, let's face it. Divorce kills. The average cost in the United States for a divorce is $13,000. It's not uncommon for a divorce to cost well into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. At Remus, we take into consideration you, the divorcing spouse, your property, your money, and your children. We assist clients in directing them to therapy, mentorship programs, savings. We mitigate the cost of divorce to keep your expenses down. We look out for the client holistically.
I came to Remus Law seeking a divorce. Salon listened to me. I told him my story. When he mailed me a copy of the complaint, which summarized my story, he was able to say exactly what I had been feeling for so many years. When my husband was served with the complaint, he came to me with tears in his eyes. He said he didn't know this is how I was really feeling. He asked if we could try again.
At Remus, we do all that we can for our clients.
Wait a little bit longer, wait a little, we'll be coming around again, 'cause you know we're stronger than we were when you and I began. I don't know what's harder, holding on or letting go. I don't know if we oughta, know if we oughta, know I don't. I don't know where I'm going, but I know it's gonna be good. I don't know where we're going, but I know it's gonna be good.
The lessons taught in the adventures of Uncle Billy and Ross are lesson that adults learn late in life. Some never learn it. I will recommend every parent, every young person, every adult read this book. But more importantly, apply the lessons.